managed by Tetra Tech, follows the Australian government's DFAT standards on fraud prevention, child protection, and preventing sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. Anonymous reports can be made via the Responsible Business Practices website. This reflects our shared commitment to dignity, respect, and safety in all program activities. Without further ado, may I invite Mr. Richard Emerson Elliott, Assistant Secretary in the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Australia's lead for ANZFTA and RCEP, to deliver his welcoming remarks.
Thank you so much. I don't want to mess with the microphone, I might break it, but try to talk loud enough to be picked up. Good afternoon all. Selamat petang. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and thank you so much. That's okay. Thank you so much for putting this wonderful event on. So I want to thank, first of all, the Regional Trade for Development team and our Trade and Gender Equality Incubator team for being here and for organising the event. And thank you, of course, to the National University of Malaysia for your wonderful hospitality. It's somewhat daunting for me to give opening remarks when I have a panel around me who are such illustrious and distinguished leaders in their field. So I'm quite blessed. So I would like to thank Tan Sri Rebecca for her presence, as well as Datuk Hafsa, Professor Dr. Sufyan, and of course Dr. Mia Mikic for their participation. I want to briefly talk about Australia's partnership with ASEAN, which is an extremely important one. Our security, our prosperity, and our economic future are intimately linked with that of Southeast Asia. By 2040, Southeast Asia is expected to be the world's fourth largest economy. Its middle class is already close to 200 million people, which is a consumer market 10 times bigger than Australia's. And our two-way trade has grown and is now worth $195 billion in 2024. So ASEAN matters for Australia, and it's a relationship that has been built over decades. None more so than our trade architecture, as represented by the ASEAN-Australia-New Zealand Free Trade Area, which we're talking about today, as well as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And of course, our Malaysia-Australia Free Trade Agreement. These trade agreements have served us well, promoting economic prosperity and resilience. But as the world evolves, then our trade agreements, our trade architecture needs to evolve as well. And so Australia now has a strong, long-standing history of supporting inclusive trade and economic partnerships in the ASEAN region. We're committed to advancing inclusive trade to ensure benefits flow to all people. Through ANZFTA and RCEP, we are committed to advancing regional integration, delivering tangible, sustainable benefits to all segments of society, including women, people with disabilities, and micro, small, and medium enterprises. Gender equality is not only a development priority, it's a strategic economic imperative. Gender equality is a necessary foundation for peace, prosperity, and stability. Inclusivity drives economic growth. It enhances social cohesion, and it increases the well-being of all members of society. So promoting women's economic equality and inclusive trade is a key priority for Australia, and it's a key priority for our international gender equality strategy. Our commitment to the $48.7 million Regional Trade for Development program, which has helped to put on today's event, places gender equality and social inclusion at the heart of its work. Australia also funds $5 million for the Trade and Gender Equality Incubator to conduct research and pilots approaches to support gender equality in trade policy, implementation, and cooperation. It supports the research that we are here for today. It's the first of its kind in Malaysia, this research, to apply a gender lens to the implementation of a major regional trade agreement. So today's workshop's a great example of how research and dialogue can help us shape more inclusive trade policies under ASEAN-Australia-New Zealand Free Trade Area. In conclusion, I want to note that 2025 is a special year for ANZFTA. It is the 15th anniversary year of the agreement. It also represents the year of entry into force for the ANZFTA upgrade, which supports our deepening ties through new provisions on digital inclusion and MSMEs. But importantly, ASEAN's first trade and sustainable development chapter. As we progress implementation of ANZFTA and its upgrade, we will remain committed to supporting gender-responsive initiatives. I'd like to congratulate all partners and all those involved in this innovative research today, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Emerson Elliott, for the opening remarks. Now, we will hear the presentation of research findings on gender impacts of the agreement establishing the ASEAN-Australia-New Zealand Free Trade Area in Malaysia, with a focus on healthcare, tourism, and e-commerce. These findings will set the stage for our high-level discussion. The presentation will be delivered by Ms. Tara Francis, lead on Trade and Development Initiatives in Asia at New Markets Lab. The presentation will be for 30 minutes, which will be followed by questions and answers. For online participants, please send questions to the chat box. Our staff will send your questions to Ms. Tara Francis after the presentation. Ms. Francis, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can someone adjust the mic for me, please? Sorry. Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. Good afternoon, and thank you for being here. My name is Tara Francis, and I lead... Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, I'll start again. Good afternoon, and thank you for being here. My name is Tara Francis, and I lead trade and development work in Asia for New Markets Lab, which is a non-profit based in Washington, D.C. Today, I'll be sharing the findings from a preliminary analysis looking at the gender impact of the agreement establishing the ASEAN-Australia-New Zealand Free Trade Area, or the ANZFTA, in Malaysia. This study is part of a broader effort to assess how trade agreements influence gender equality and women's participation in the economy. So let me give you a brief overview of the structure before I go into my presentation. First, I'll set out the research objectives, outlining the purpose and goals of the study. Second, I'll walk you through the research questions, where we used a mixed methods approach, a combination of legal and policy review combined with stakeholder interviews. Next, I'll present our findings with a focus on two priority areas, services and e-commerce. Then I'll highlight some of the challenges that we faced during the study, including the gaps in data and policy alignment. And finally, I'll conclude with the recommendations and a way forward, looking at some of the provisions in the upgraded ANZFTA. I start with the point that trade is not gender neutral, and let me explain why. Trade doesn't affect everyone in the same way. Its impact on women and men can be quite different because it's shaped by the inequalities that already exist and by the different economic roles women tend to have. Take women entrepreneurs, for example. Estimates suggest that women make up only 11 to 20% of Malaysian exporting firms. On top of that, they face additional barriers, from limited access to finance in international markets, and hurdles to business formalization, all of which makes it harder to scale globally. As consumers, women contend with income inequality and lack of consumer protection. The Global Gender Index Gap reports that women in Malaysia earn 71.5% of what men earn for similar work. This is certainly about the global average, which shows progress but not parity. And as workers, women are concentrated in low-wage, low-skilled and informal jobs, making them more vulnerable to trade shocks. So what's the bottom line here? If we don't address these inequalities head-on, trade risks reinforcing these gaps rather than closing them. And that's why a gender analysis is so important. So what were the objectives of this research? First is to generate evidence on the ex-post impact of the ASEAN-Australia-New. The analysis aims to give us hard data or the lack of it, showing how women participate in trade and where the barriers exactly lie. The hope is for this evidence to feed into trade policy discussions and equip government officials and negotiators with practical insights to bring gender into future trade deals. We also aim to inform the future activities of the Trade and Gender Equality Incubator and use what we have learned to inform future TGEI programs, especially when they are implemented in the Malaysian context. So why the ASEAN-Australia-New? ASEAN-Australia-New is one of Malaysia's earliest and most comprehensive trade agreements. It covers a number of issue areas, including goods, services, investment, e-commerce, and cooperation across multiple sectors. Services specifically plays an important role. ASEAN-Australia partners account for 46% of Malaysia's services exports and 26% of its imports. It's also notable that the agreement is the first Malaysian trade agreement to include an e-commerce chapter. It introduced provisions on paperless trading, e-authentication, and consumer protection, measures that lower costs and improve efficiency, and this is specifically important for entrepreneurs, especially women entrepreneurs. This is also a timely moment for the analysis. The second protocol to the agreement, or the ASEAN-Australia-New upgrade, entered into force for Malaysia on 21st April 2025. It builds upon the original agreement in many ways. First, the agreement includes a dedicated trade and sustainable development chapter. It also brings in commitments that matter for gender equality, such as digital inclusion, MSME support, cooperation on women's economic empowerment. Taken together, these changes really open the door for more inclusive and sustainable trade across the region. So let me come to the research questions, which was based on the mixed methods approach that I mentioned earlier. We began by identifying the parts of ASEAN-Australia-New most relevant for the gender analysis, focusing on why key service subsectors and e-commerce areas have an impact on women. We also examined Malaysia's commitments in detail. So each issue areas, that is services and e-commerce, required a different approach because of how they are structured in scope and design. So services, as you know, are scheduled on a sector-specific and mode-specific basis, outlining market access and national treatment limitations, and that's how I would be presenting my findings. And e-commerce are typically horizontal, applying across sectors and framed more as cooperation and facilitation measures. We also reviewed domestic policy and legal frameworks linked to ASEAN-Australia-New to see how they address gender inclusion. Then we assessed available data to understand women participation as entrepreneurs, consumers, and employees. We conducted consultations with key informant key informant interviews with stakeholders. This complemented the desk review. Our analysis was not without challenges. The most significant challenge we faced was the lack of sex disaggregated data. I would say the limited availability of sex disaggregated data than lack of. And I will expand on it throughout my presentation. The scope is also confined to the first protocol, though I do touch upon the upgrade later in my presentation. It focuses on Malaysia's own commitments and does not examine the commitments of other parties in relation to Malaysia. Securing engagement with some senior policymakers was challenging because of their limited availability, but we were able to speak with key stakeholders like MITI, SME Corp, and the Ministry of Tourism, Arts and Agriculture. And finally, there's what we call the noodle bowl effect. With so many overlapping trade agreements, it's exactly hard to tell what's coming from one, but we try to establish linkage. So let me get to the second part of the study, which is I've essentially divided my presentation into 4 parts, and the second part is findings on the services sector. So when we were trying to identify subsectors that were relevant for the analysis, we tried to look at sectors that are where women are concentrated and sectors that have commitments under the ASEAN-Australia-New. So there we looked at labor force participation rate and sector-specific data published by the DOSM. In healthcare, we found that 2/3 of all persons engaged, including owners and paid employees, are women. But they're highly, I'm so sorry. Okay. So as I was saying, in healthcare, we found that 2/3 of all persons engaged, including owners and paid employees, are women. But they're highly represented in wage labor, but not as much in leadership positions. In tourism, we couldn't find sector level data, but we did find relevant subsector data which showed that 44% of paid employees in accommodation and 45% in food and beverages subsector are women. Again, they're a major part of the workforce, but often concentrated in lower paying jobs. These sectors are also not small players in the Malaysian economy. Healthcare is alone projected to hit $30 billion by 2027, thanks in part to medical tourism and export, and tourism is already a giant, being the 3rd largest contributor to GDP. We also try to identify some of the challenges that women face in these sectors. So we found that in accommodation and food services, women earn less than 23% less than men. However, this was more global data. We couldn't find Malaysia-specific data on this, and this is the kind of data gap that I was talking about. In both sectors, we found that women face limited leadership opportunities. They face safety and harassment risk, and this was confirmed by stakeholders in their interviews. And there's also limited availability of data that obscures inequalities. So before I actually go into more specific findings, I'd like to talk about the subsectors where Malaysia has committed under the services schedule. So under healthcare, for example, Malaysia has made commitments specifically under 3 service sectors: medical specialty services, veterinary services, and private hospital services. If you really look closely at the data in these sectors, you will actually see that the sectors where women make up majority are not included. This includes nursing, midwifery, pharmacy, dentistry, and allied health. So these are not included in the services schedule. In tourism, the commitment covers hotel, restaurants, resort services, and services like travel agencies and tour operators, but not sectors where I sort of presented earlier that women are highly concentrated, like food and beverages and accommodation. Now, if you look at Mode 1 specifically, and what is Mode 1? Mode 1 covers the cross-border supply of services into Malaysia without the need to travel. So think of telemedicine or remote consultations for healthcare and services by online booking platforms or travel agencies to Malaysian consumers. Malaysia has kept its commitments relatively open in this sector, which means that there are no restrictions on foreign providers providing services into Malaysia. So for consumers, this could mean more choice and competitive prices. And for businesses, they could face increasing competition from foreign service suppliers. To completely utilize this mode, digital access is also needed so that Mode 1 remains accessible. We looked at domestic initiatives that were relevant under this mode, and we found domestic initiatives essentially push for digital adoption. Examples of this being the My Digital National Tourism Policy, the Healthcare White Paper, the Tourism Recovery Plans. All of these initiatives push for digital adoption as well as focus on women having more access to ICT. We found some data that was relevant. One pandemic era study noted that, and which surveyed over 835,000 pharmacy telehealth records, found that women made up nearly 59% of consumers of telehealth, showing strong female uptake in this sector. On the business side, when talking to stakeholders who run online tourism businesses, they confirmed that women-owned MSME stakeholders feel pressure from foreign suppliers who often have more digital capacity. Going to Mode 2 commitments. So Mode 2 is pretty simple, but it's yet the most relevant. It's about foreign consumers traveling into Malaysia to access services. So healthcare, this essentially means medical tourism. And in tourism, it's visitors coming into Malaysia to access tourist services. Again, Malaysia has not really imposed any restrictions under this sector. What Mode 2 can do is it can provide opportunities for entrepreneurs and workers in healthcare and tourism, where women are majorly employed. So foreign patients mean higher demand for healthcare services, where women MSMEs are highly engaged, and increased foreign visitors could boost demand for accommodation, food services, homestays, handicrafts, etc., sectors where women are active as MSME owners and workers. This largely aligns with domestic policy, which has been pushing to grow these sectors, and you'll see a lot of growth in these sectors over the past many years. We also looked at data from the WTO, and specifically WTO's trade and services by mode of supply data, or TISMOS, shows that most Malaysian services exports in the health and tourism sector come from Mode 2. So Mode 2 is highly relevant for both the sectors. Data here was limited. What would have helped was having data on women entrepreneurs and workers engaging to foreign tourists and providing foreign services to foreign consumers. Services to foreign consumers. Mode 3 is essentially where foreign entities set up commercial presence in Malaysia to provide services, making it the mode closely tied to foreign investment services. Malaysia, as with a lot of countries, take a cautious approach here, with permitted foreign investment subject to equity caps and restrictions. What this can do is this can shield domestic firms, including foreign-owned businesses, but limit partnership with foreign entities. One interesting fact here is that domestic reforms appear to be more expansive than the ASEAN-Australia-New commitments themselves, because they took place after the agreement was signed. So domestically, there's more foreign investments space in these sectors than the FTA actually requires. We also looked at data from the Malaysia Investment Development Authority, which reported that services absorbed the majority of FDI in 2024, and there was significant investment in both healthcare and tourism sector. This indicates strong FDI flows into these sectors. However, data on foreign ownership and joint venture participation by women was not available. So the next mode, and this is the last mode under services, Mode 4 concerns the movement of natural persons and governs the temporary entry of foreign services providers into Malaysia. So this is limited. Usually these commitments are limited to high skilled categories under horizontal limits. Many women usually work in semi-skilled roles, but these roles are usually excluded under FTAs, including here. Globally, Mode 4 is a small slice of services trade, just under 3%, and it's also tightly regulated, making it less relevant for most women as workers and entrepreneurs. So just to round up this section on services, I'd like to highlight the challenges that we faced. One is data gaps. So there's data gaps on understanding digital participation, women's employment in tourism and medical tourism sector, gender disaggregated data on FDI ownership, sex disaggregated data on FDI ownership structures, and sex disaggregated data on migration, making it difficult to assess ANZFTA's gender impact in services. There's also a disconnect between domestic reforms and ANZFTA obligations. The linkages are quite weak, and I said that the noodle bowl effect exists, where the impact of assessing the impact of ANZFTA was quite challenging because of the existence of other agreements like the ASEAN Framework Agreement on Services, which liberalized these sectors much more. And finally, services itself is a really difficult area to assess impact. Services are intangible, unlike goods, which you can weigh them, you can count them in containers. But measuring services inherently is inherently more complex. So therefore, there is a need to understand how to assess services in the context of gender a lot more. Okay, I come to e-commerce next. So when ANZFTA was signed back in 2009, it was actually the very first agreement in this region to have a dedicated e-commerce chapter, as I mentioned earlier. So at that time, the approach was about cooperation and setting a foundation for e-commerce, unlike newer commitments like CPTPP, which go a little further with some binding commitments. The original text didn't mention gender or inclusion as much, but the ANZFTA upgrade changes that. So to conduct the analysis on e-commerce, we categorize the provisions into 3 overarching areas. And this categorization allowed for a more clearer framework for assessment. So first we have general and cooperation provisions, which are important because they encourage countries to promote e-commerce through cooperation initiatives. Then comes trade facilitation measures, including e-authentication, paperless trading, which reduces costs and aims to make cross-border trade smoother. And lastly, we focused on consumer and data protection provisions, which ensures that online consumers have the same protection as offline ones. So the first category of provisions was essentially a catch-all, and it covered objectives, transparency, domestic regulatory frameworks, and cooperation. So Article 9 specifically on cooperation is especially relevant because it includes provisions on promoting cooperation between the parties on e-commerce and MSMEs. Since women in Malaysia are heavily concentrated in the MSME sectors, this support in the form of training, capacity building, regulatory reforms could make a real difference. However, as I said, at the point that the agreement was signed, most of the provisions were more non-binding, so it sort of depends upon the government on how much to deliver under these provisions. And I would say Malaysia has delivered. Malaysia has delivered initiatives to promote e-commerce adoption and MSMEs, and you see this through initiatives like MSME Digital Transformation Program, the National E-Commerce Strategic Roadmap, Malaysia Digital, and more recently, Empower Her. This shows that there is a strong domestic commitment, but again, the linkage of ANZFTA is quite indirect. The second category of provisions were trade facilitation commitments. These focus on processes that make trade faster, cheaper, and more reliable, and are important to reduce cost. According to UNCTAD, and this was a study in 2024, women-owned businesses spend 1.5 times more clearing customs compared to male-owned businesses, highlighting significant gender differentiated barriers in trade processes. And this is why digitization of trade facilitation processes can help. Again, the language is broad, and I don't really mean that as a huge criticism. It was just how at that time the agreement was structured. Now it has progressed to more binding commitments, which I will cover later. On the domestic side, Malaysia and these domestic reforms were taken close to the signing of the ANZFTA. So even though we cannot establish direct linkage, there is probably a temporal linkage between the actual commitments and domestic reforms. Malaysia moved with the E-Commerce Act and amendments with the Consumer Protection Act, giving electronic contract signatures and transactions the same legal standing as paper-based one. Last, I want to cover consumer and data protection provisions. So this is found in Article 6 and 7, which sets out protections for consumers, online consumers, and personal data. Why is this relevant? This reduces risk when using e-commerce platforms and build confidence in digital trade. Our research shows that 70%, and this was based on research that's already done, 70% of online fraud victims in Malaysia are young, educated women between the age of 26 to 35. This shows that there is that women are active users of digital platforms, but they also face increased vulnerabilities. We also found data published by Malaysia's Tribunal for Consumer Claims, which handled 11,046 cases in 2023, majorly involving goods like electronic goods, though the sex disaggregated data here is not available, and electronic goods also covers a lot of areas. So this does not directly relate just to e-commerce. So that's where I say the data, there needs to be more data on this. On the domestic side here as well, we found reforms that closely align with the timing of the ANZFTA, especially the Personal Data Protection Act of 2010, which created Malaysia's first comprehensive data privacy framework. Just to summarize this section by providing an overview of the gaps and challenges, the first one, of course, is sex disaggregated data, and I've highlighted that throughout my presentation. The second is the structural challenge that I said that we faced, that these provisions were broad and used flexible languages. So progress here was hard to measure. But we did find that ANZFTA cooperation ACCEP did carry out a number of programs that targeted e-commerce and MSMEs. So there were a number of initiatives. It also requires, when provisions are broad, it's also difficult to track implementation. Though we do see a lot of domestic reforms that came about during ANZFTA and after, it's really difficult to tie that to the agreement itself. So let me come to the way forward, the ANZFTA upgrade. The ANZFTA upgrade has a lot to offer in terms of not only building on the original agreement, but also providing scope for implementing the agreement in an inclusive manner. So first, with respect to services, we are seeing a shift to a more liberalized approach through adoption of a negative list. That basically means the sectors are more open unless they're specifically included. Some of the commitments, as I said, that were not included in the previous schedule, like commitments relating to dental, nursing, and food services, are included in this agreement. So you really see a lot of scope in sectors where women are largely employed. There's also room for more joint venture partnerships beyond the limits that was provided in the original agreement. In relation to e-commerce, the upgrade also involves provisions to promote digital inclusion matters. The agreement sets out that parties may work together to address barriers in access to e-commerce, develop participation programs, and share best practices relating to digital inclusion. So this is where maybe gender-responsive programs can come in relation to e-commerce. Another piece that's new is in the upgrade is the moratorium on customs duties for electronic transmissions. This could potentially help digital goods and services be more affordable. We did this study with this study two years ago, and this is not based in Malaysia, but this was in Kenya and South Africa, where we actually studied the impact of lifting the moratorium on MSMEs, and we surveyed around 400 to 500 MSMEs throughout both countries, and we concluded that lifting the moratorium at the WTO level would actually have an adverse effect on MSMEs in both countries. But again, I qualify that we haven't done this in Malaysia, so that would be interesting to see. And finally, ANZFTA has moved from broader obligations to more binding ones. Provisions on paperless trading, e-authentication, and consumer protection are now binding under the upgrade. The ANZFTA upgrade represents a real shift from soft cooperation-based provision to more liberalized, binding, and inclusive commitments. The way forward is to ensure that these commitments are implemented with a gender-responsive lens, so that women entrepreneurs, workers, and consumers can fully benefit from them. In terms of the recommendations, we've kind of structured it under 4 buckets. One is the data and evidence. Second is capacity building and skills development. Third is networking and partnership. And fourth is policy reforms and advocacy. So in relation to data and evidence, governments, international organizations can strengthen the collection of sex disaggregate data and support independent research. So we have a clearer picture of women's participation in services and e-commerce. Researchers and NGOs can also contribute through case studies and applied research. On capacity building and skills development, policymakers and development partners can help by expanding access to finance, ICT tools, digital skills, and targeted training programs for women entrepreneurs. Private sector, such as business associations, can play a major role in building networks and partnerships and training opportunities. And Using this evidence, policymakers and researchers and international partners can also push for gender-responsive trade reforms. So just to conclude, I want to say that Malaysia's commitments under the ASEAN-FTA aimed to create opportunities under healthcare, tourism, and e-commerce, sectors where women played a big role. But there are still gaps. The commitments were broad, data is fragmented, and women still face a number of challenges. The upgrade now provides us an opportunity not only to Malaysia but ASEAN member states to align more closely with gender initiatives and to make sure women MSMEs really benefit. Moving forward, the focus has to be on shifting gender responsive policies, improving data systems, and giving women entrepreneurs the support they need. And that's how we make sure trade benefits everyone. So before I end my presentation, I just want to thank everyone who was part of this study. The report was prepared for the Trade and Gender Equality Hub, funded by the Australian government through the Regional Trade for Development Program, which supports ASEAN member states in maximizing from trade agreements like ANZFTA and RCEP. The study was led by Cadmus Group, and I want to give a special shout out to Kate for her support throughout the study. Research and analysis was conducted by a team at New Markets Lab, including Professor Katrin Kuhlman, Dari Al-Salah, and myself. We also are grateful for field research carried out by colleagues at Engender LLC, a non-profit based in Malaysia. Specifically want to thank Omna Srini Ong and Nuraiza Shamsul Bahrain. And for the insights and feedback of Mylin, who's not here, Sebastian Cortez Sanchez, Erin Weiser, Miami Cape, and Kate, there she is, and Kate Francis. I would also like to thank the National University of Malaysia for giving us the platform to present here, and for all of you for joining the discussion. I welcome your thoughts and questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Francis, for your insightful presentation. We will now open the floor for questions and answers. To begin, we'll take 2 questions from the floor, and then we'll move on to 2 questions from our online participants.
Can we give her a mic? Is that?
This. Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm Claire Shirley from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Wellington. Can you hear me, or is it good? It stopped crackling. Yeah. So I was interested in your recommendation on capacity building, and in which areas do you think would have the most impact?
Okay, I'm gonna. Yes, I'm trying to see if. Okay, I'm trying to see if the sound stops at some point, but.
It's finished now.
Okay, so for capacity building, I mean, if you look at the research that we did, and the stakeholders that we spoke to, I would say the first thing is digital access. One of the research that we found was that MSMEs, women-owned MSMEs, 25% of them have advanced level of digitization, but 75 remain at basic levels of digitization. And for services, for mode 1, if you really want to compete with foreign suppliers, I would say digitization is huge, and for e-commerce as well. So I would say the first gap that I found, and also in today's world, I feel like digital access and understanding how to use digital tools is the most important, and it can make everything so much more easier. Trade facilitation, as I said, women take more than 1.5 times more to complete customs procedures. So I would say digital access would be the first space. Also capacity building around trade. A lot of women that we spoke to didn't really know the advantages that a trade agreement can provide, the kind of market access they have once a trade agreement is implemented. So I think that those two areas, our report has really specific recommendations as well, but I would say that these two sort of, jump out at me right now. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you for your presentation. I have multiple questions,
Okay.
but I'll keep it short.
Okay.
So one is which I'm actually also giving homework for the panelists. Thank you very much. The idea for services liberalization. So there's one view that if you liberalize a service either unilaterally or either through a trade agreement to whichever trade partner, by nature of how services are liberalized,
Yeah.
it in practice, although it's not legally binding, it does apply to all trading partners. What are your views on that? In view of the benefits or opportunities available on a gender perspective. I'm also interested in terms of your approach, looking at Malaysia's liberalization, Malaysia's services schedule rather than the liberalization afforded to Malaysian exporters, for example, the schedules of the trading partners. Because your current approach assumes that Malaysia liberalizing its own sector is good for Malaysian women, or versus, so what's the view on whether liberalization is actually good for Malaysian women given the sectors that they are in and given the level of work that they do? Yeah.
So let me answer the second question first. I think that was kind of how the study was scoped. I think it would have been beneficial to look into the schedules of other countries under the services schedule, their services schedule as well. But that's how the study was structured. And I wouldn't say that we assumed that services liberalization was automatically beneficial for women. I think there is a risk as well, especially in sectors that I pointed out, like healthcare and tourism, which is so the benefits would be more access and more to being most beneficial for women, but there's also the risk of competition that you see under mode 1. So I would qualify our the assumption under that. Can you maybe repeat your first question because with an example, please?
Some of the things that you seemed worried about in the study pointed to the fact that, say, for example, the liberalization didn't happen through ASEAN-Australia-New, but it did happen through other agreements. But what some academics say is that in practice, from an economics point of view, it doesn't matter, because
Yeah.
in practice, once you liberalize a sector, it is hard for policymakers to sorry, it does policymakers generally don't see the point of limiting a service sector investment from Australia versus from Brunei
Yeah.
or from Saudi Arabia, because of the nature of services. It's not tariffs. So yeah, so I just wanted to get your views on what that meant in practice for women in Malaysia.
I think ANZFTA is only one. We don't see ANZFTA as sort of having driven the liberalization in the services sector for these subsectors, but we see ANZFTA as part of it. So because it is commercial presence and because it's investment, it's the reference is to domestic law to a large extent. I don't know if anybody else also wants to take that question.
No worries. Thank you. It also depends on how the liberalization is done for that sector. If it's tied to an MRA, then it's very specific to the FTA. So it really depends. So if like you're liberalizing for Australia, for example, architects, then between the architect associations of Malaysia and Australia, they would have an agreement. So the liberalization would be limited to them. So it's not automatic MFN. Doesn't work like that, I think. Hope that answers.
Okay, thank you. Any online questions? I don't see.
Do we have any online questions from the online participants? No. Okay.
So we don't have any online questions. So do we want to take two more questions from here? With the difficult question.
I'll go ahead since no one put up their hand. But so I'm interested in your conversation on SMEs versus particularly in view of the gender lens on it.
Okay.
So given the high linkage between SMEs and women, in terms of focusing on negotiations, for example, would it then make more sense to focus on elements that would promote SME linkages rather than trying to and then therefore do like you said training and so not for women in SMEs rather than finding elements that promote the sectors that they work on.
Okay, so I think SMEs from a trade, just in terms of the commitments that are there in the trade agreement, SMEs come under cooperation. So those are sort of how you can tie in SME capacity building, for example, under agreements. To really advocate for women-owned SMEs, I think you have to understand the barriers and the protections that they need and how that translates into a commitment under a trade agreement. So, for example, if you take digital access to be an issue with MSMEs, you can build in capacity building as an area of cooperation under e-commerce, for example. In services, it's very services commitments are just structured so differently that MSME within the commitments itself, maybe MSME related issues may not come in as clearly, but there's definitely capacity building language that you can use within the agreement to build service sector capacity building of MSMEs on board. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think there's another issue which is very important for women in micro, small, and medium enterprises is the access to compliance and testing. The capacity building, but can they afford the compliance and testing that will allow them to export their products? Because most of the MSMEs, they might not be in the services, but they produce products. And for ASEAN member states, especially in the Mekong sub-region, they have a lot of issues with compliance and testing. For example, in meeting the sanitary and phytosanitary requirement of having access to Australia or New Zealand, where the standards are much higher than what we have in this region. So I think if we look at the utilization, we are not just looking at the utilization from the certificate of origin, but also the utilization from the perspective of providing real access to be able to trade. And we know that most of the time the medium, not the micro enterprises are women-led. And normally they don't even understand, or they don't even know that any free trade agreement exists. So we need to go down to the ground and explain to them that these are the things that would probably provide them with some market access. Another issue which I think needs to be covered is the requirement for environmental, social, and governance, ESG. This is becoming a trend. Many private multinational or big enterprises are imposing ESG standards on small and medium enterprises to meet. And this is beyond the government. So as we know, under free trade agreement or the WTO framework, private standards are not covered by dispute settlement. But private standards are the one that cause a lot of issues in trade. So how do we then get the ASEAN-Australia-New or this kind of free trade agreement to assist women entrepreneurs in having some kind of benefit from free trade agreements that is actually causing a lot of issues for them in the first place, especially in ESG and testing and compliance. I think those are the issues that we probably need to cover if you have more time in this study.
Yeah, I think that maybe is a part of a future study covering these issues, but these are relevant issues. And when we talk to SMEs as well, they cited that they got some support for a while, and that really helped them. That really helped them scale. But then when that support is withdrawn, maybe for purposes that is out of their control, they are back to zero. So I think there is an important need for capacity building, but also continued support and understand. And that's where really that's what I mean. Our study doesn't say AANZFTA did X, Y, Z. Our study says that there are a lot of gaps, and the agreement can really help bridge these gaps with the kind of new commitments that the agreement brings on. Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Tara Francis, for sharing those valuable findings and recommendations. We will now move on to our high-level panel discussion on how ASEAN member states can enhance support to gender equality and better measure gender impacts in implementing the upgraded ASEAN-AUSTRALIA. It is my pleasure to invite the members of this panel, moderator Professor Dr. Sufyan Jusso, Vice Chancellor of UKM. Our esteemed panelists are Tan Sri Dr. Fatima Santa Maria, Pro-Chancellor of Sunway University and Senior Advisor to the Asia Group, Dato Dr. Hafsa Hashim, Chairperson of the Women Leadership Foundation, Mr. Richard Emerson Elliott, Assistant Secretary in the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Australia's lead for ASEAN-AUSTRAlia and RCEP, Dr. Mia Mikic, Research Associate, Waikato University, who will be joining us online from New Zealand.
Thank you
We
very
look
much.
forward to your reflections on how trade can be a powerful driver of women's economic empowerment and gender equality. Thank you. Prof. Sufyan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ranhan, for helping organizing this event. First of all, I would like to welcome everyone to the National University of Malaysia. We also have the Dean of the Faculty of Education, the host of this event, Professor Mahazan. Thank you very much for letting us use your auditorium, very nice auditorium. Right, we have 1 hour or so for discussion. This is a very important topic of the day. I was involved in the ASEAN-AUSTRALIA implementation way back in 2012-13, at the very beginning of the ASEAN-AUSTRALIA, where we were involved with the assessment of the investment chapter. And now we see the upgrade of the agreement itself. So here we are looking at how a free trade agreement like ASEAN-Australia-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement can actually support gender equality. And most importantly for me is to support micro, small and medium enterprises, which are more than 90% of businesses in ASEAN. And if we look at Malaysia, for example, we have a lot of women entrepreneurs, and they are very excited about trade, especially in fashion, digital businesses. They do a lot of transactions on electronic commerce. So these are the areas that we may want to look at. Another angle which I think one is missing from the study is the education services. Not because we are here in a university, but if we look at women, many of them ended up in education services. And they are very good in providing teaching and research and leading universities and education service providers. Right, we have 4 very distinguished panelists with us this afternoon. Online, we have Mia. Dr. Mia Miki is a research associate from Waikato University, very good friend, old friend from the days in UNS Cup. So thank you, Mia, for joining online. I know it's quite late for you in New Zealand. And then we have Tan Sri Dato Dr. Rebecca Stamaria, the Pro-Chancellor of Sunway University and Senior Advisor of the Asia Group. We all know her, former Secretary General of Ministry of MITI, Ministry of, now it's Investment, Trade and Industry. Used to be International Trade and Investment. So, and Industry. So like, okay, Ministry of Investment, Trade and Industry. Then Chancellor Rebecca served as the Executive Director of the APEC Secretariat in Singapore. We used to work together during the TPP negotiation. And then we have Dr. Hafsa Hashim, the chairperson of Women Leadership Foundation, Malaysia, formerly the CEO of the SME Corporation and Agency under the Ministry of Investment, Trade and Industry. We worked together during the APEC Championship, the Malaysia's Championship, sorry, Malaysia's Championship for ASEAN 2025 to prepare one of the priority economic deliverables on women leadership in trade. And then we have Mr. Richard Emerson Elliott. We heard from Richard before. He's the Assistant Secretary in the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, DFAT, and the lead, Australia's lead for ASEAN-Australia-New and Regional Cooperation Economic Partnership Agreement, RCEP. So right, I think we will start with Mia. You have 10 minutes. Mia, please.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sufyan. I just need to share my slides, if I may. Let me see. I think in order for me to share the slides, you will need to remove these other ones. Okay, let me see how this goes. And this one. Can you see the slides, Sufyan?
Yeah, we can see. Go ahead.
Oh, okay, good. I will try to be quick, but I have to start with, of course, thanking for the invitation. It is really a great pleasure to be in this panel. But I also want to congratulate to Tara and the team for delivering very robust and comprehensive research. And I think from the results that she has presented, the significance of those results are there both from the perspective of what they show and also from the perspective of what they cannot show. And I think, you know, she went into great detail of why is that so, but I think through the discussion in this panel, we may also tease out some of further elements in that. I will, and thank you, Sufyan, for prompting my presentation through some of the questions that you posed me. But I would want to start with a definition, because that's always a good start. And we have heard about the gender impact assessment or gender impact analysis that was a primary research tool that was used in Tara's undertaking. And I think it's good for everyone to understand what it is. And in the simplest terms, it is just a tool that is used to evaluate how policies, programs, initiatives, trade agreements can affect women and men differently. And of course, this is the simple definition, but it does give us a sort of way to understand potential inequalities and ensures that decisions promote gender equality and inclusive outcomes. There is more technical definition, but I think, and of course the objective, I will be talking about the objective of using gender impact assessment a little bit later. But I wanted to start with this very simple definition. And then we need to also ask, why do we need to talk about gender equality and women's economic empowerment? And I think Richard has already emphasized the reasons why. And, you know, he said that gender equality is not just a social goal or a simple fairness issue or a principle, but it is economic necessity. It is the strategic issue. It is the matter of productivity. And so I think it is important to keep that in mind. Why? Because, you know, we understand that trade can affect a position of women and Tara was going into great details about that. But we also need to understand that performance of trade liberalization, and if you wish, even the outcome of trade agreement, highly also depends on the status of gender equality that is currently in an economy. And so we cannot expect that with a high level of gender inequality or many gender gaps, that the economy will be functioning at the full speed and delivering fully in all areas, including trade. And so it is important to keep in mind, and I have just put 2 slides in my presentations as the illustration of the current level of gender gaps for the ASEAN member states, and in particular for Malaysia. And one can, I'm not going to go into detail because of the time, but one can really look at the great gender gaps, in particular as we look into women's participation in various sectors. Why is that important? Because if we don't understand where these disparities are, and we overlay the certain policy changes, then we will not be able to track, monitor, and get the impact of those policy changes in a proper way. So it is very important to understand these things, and that will be one actually step forward that would enable better analysis later on as one start with the changes of the policies, because you would already have at the zero level of the initiative, trade agreement, or whatever policy change is, as a set of data that will guide then the analysis as we move on through the implementation of certain policies. So going back to the analysis, or in short, we call it GL, but I think it's an awkward acronym. So the gender impact assessment is not a bureaucratic exercise, right? It is not also optional. It should be an essential tool in all policy sectors. And of course, when we talk about trade agreements, then it should be the essential starting point in formulating negotiation mandate of these trade agreements, because through these mandates, you would need to understand what are the gender inequalities in the country already, what are the sectors that are sensitive to the changes in the in the structure of these sectors with respect to potential contraction or expansion. And of course, it would guide the negotiators in that way. And of course, you do it along through the implementation as ex post element, and the modernization of any agreement should be based actually on how this gender assessment is done. And I think here we come to the very important point, which was not, I think, emphasized by Tara sufficiently. And the point is that trade agreement can have a provision that is related to the gender equality and women's economic empowerment. As a matter of fact, 30% of trade agreements globally have some kind of provisions that are related to improving women's position through trade. After the ASEAN-AUSTRALIA in its first installment didn't mention gender or woman empowerment at all, and then in the modernized version it is mentioned once, I think, directly, and in a general sense in the chapter on trade and sustainable development, and indirectly through trade facilitation, where the discrimination of operators is being actually excluded. So why is that important? When you have provisions in the trade agreement, these provisions then have to do with trade issues and with trade barriers, right? And so then when you have those, then your analysis will be able to actually focus and will be able to zoom in on how these trade barriers are removed through the process of implementation of the agreement. And hello, you will get the impact through there. If you don't have a provision, then you're actually tapping in the dark, because you have to pull out all these indirect effects through the general operation of a sector and the impact on women. And this is the problem that actually the researchers in this particular analysis were actually addressing, and I think they have done excellent work in that context. So let me just move on because my time is going on. In terms of why the government should use this particular approach, of course, especially in these new sectors that was pointed out, the digital trade that is based on regulatory measures, and there was questions about the difference between the impact of liberalization when it is dealing with the behind the border barriers rather than the border barriers. And there are, I think Rebecca very correctly pointed that it would depend in particular in services on the modes of how these liberalizations are done, etc. But when we have these provisions and the analysis done ahead of the ex ante, or if we prepare the data to be able to do the analysis, then we can actually remove these blind spots and understand where the impact is possible, where it is not. Once you are able to do that, you can very clearly then discuss with the stakeholders about the possible impacts that may be negative impacts, and are able to provide some sort of evidence in terms of the timeline of appearance of these impacts and the possible countermeasures or the correction measures that you will be undertaking to minimize these adverse effects. And of course, that increases the confidence of stakeholders in the policy choice. And of course, it gives you, as a policymaker, a legitimacy to provide further to go ahead with these changes. And of course, that ensures that there will be definitely benefits from the agreements, if that is the case that that we are discussing here as a policy change. Now, Sufyan also asked me to very quickly just mention what are the possible ways to improve or fasten or make simpler this gender impact analysis. And of course, it is always easy if you can take the data or the indicators off the shelf and use it in your analysis. That's not always the case, but there are at least sort of some guidance in terms of indicators that are used in research ongoing in this area. And of course, and I think Tara has enlisted all of these in terms of the barriers that they had in assessing the data needed for the gender impact analysis. So economic participation that relates not only to the shares of women working or not in a sector, but also the wage gaps, the number of hours worked, etc. Right? And entrepreneurship is very important, as Sufyan is very interested in MSMEs. It is the driver of every economy, but we also know that in many economies, the women are those that are in micro enterprises, and they often not only work for themselves, but they have to work for their families. Therefore, many people depend on these small and medium-sized enterprises, and it is rightly on the top of the agenda when we talk about improving the business environment for that. But how do we do that through the trade agreement? Well, you need to know what you want to do with that. If you have no data, you will not be able to target or make an intentional policy choice in that regard. And then, of course, very importantly for gender equality, it is the matter of leadership and how opening of other markets perhaps may, and text or provisions in trade agreements may help women to go to advance through the different profession that or positions in the economic sectors or even in political sectors. So there are a number of indicators that can be used, and there are also a number of platforms that are very useful as an example or as a guidance to whoever is doing this analysis, because it includes the way of how you approach qualitative analysis as opposed to quantitative analysis. And of course, there are good tools for policymakers as well in a format of checklist. Have you done this? Have you done that? And that is a reminder to whoever is doing this work to really go pedantically in terms of looking at all the aspects of gender equality promotion. So very quickly in closing, regional trade agreements as this one that we are discussing today are very important drivers of gender equality. But my position is there, and I would want to put it on the table, is that it is not a panacea. It cannot provide the answers to the problems of gender equality that are not trade related. Right? And in many cases, as Tara also indicated, many of the issues for women were barriers that are coming from structural, systemic issues, including the very obvious social norms and maybe hidden or open biases with respect to women. So trade agreements is not gonna solve that unless it has very direct provision with respect to the treatment of women in certain jobs and or positions, like it is done through the multilateral or GSI agreement on domestic services regulation, where we have a single article that actually deals with the discrimination of women as opposed to men as services provider. So you can actually have a direct language that will deal with such bias in the society, because that will then require the changes in domestic legislation, and you will very easily then be able to check whether this is done and what is the impact of women in that case. If you have no provisions of that type, your analysis is then remaining indirect, and it has to grapple with many different obstacles and data requests. So as a systemic problem, as it is gender equality, or rather inequality, we have to use a holistic set of policies rather than only trade agreements. But when we use trade agreements, we have to be rather intentional and actually add the provisions to the agreements that will be able to move the needle with respect to women's empowerment. Let me stop there, Sophia, and I hope I'm within 10 minutes, at least to my
Thank you very much, Mia. Any
Thank
question
you.
for Mia? It's quite late in New Zealand, so any question for Mia? Then we may
It's
have...
not late, Sophia, and I can stay on.
You can stay on, all right.
In the
Okay,
discussion.
fine.
Yeah, it's only 8 o'clock here.
Yeah.
No worries.
Okay, just in case you want to go for dinner.
No, don't worry.
So any question for Mia? Mia, I have one question for you, right? With all the tools and the indicators you mentioned earlier, how do we then get the governments or the authorities to really use them, or even in the university, how do we use those tools in our research to ensure that to track down the utilization of FTAs, the benefits of FTAs to women entrepreneurs?
Well, Sufyan, someone mentioned capacity building. So capacity building is always necessary even for government officials, right? And I think that's one thing. So one has to be aware of what is available and what can be done. And I think many government officials know about that. And then one has to actually request for this analysis to be done prior to the starting of negotiations in the context of formulating the mandate for negotiations. If that is not done, you will not have the use of these indicators, right?
Thank you. Let's move to our next panelist, Dr. Hafsah Hashim. So, Dr. Hafsah has a lot of experience in running an organization that supports the small and medium enterprises. So, we would like to hear from Dr. Hafsah experience in helping women entrepreneurs to engage in trade and to benefit from free trade agreements.
Thank you so much, Prof. Can I have some slides for me, please? In the first place, I think if I may, there are very good conversations here that revolve around women entrepreneurs and also conversations around how they can benefit from these FTAs. So let me begin this conversation on why this ANZAC FTA matters, which is the upgrade form. And here is where, of course, what we hope to expect is that there'll be better access to ASEAN, Australia, and New Zealand markets. There'll be better, more certain regulatory reforms. There will be better sustainable trade development that comes in that facilitate SMEs to do business. And as we talk about SMEs, we don't forget also that in the MSMEs, majority, as we have alluded to this afternoon, a lot of them are also women. I'll go to some statistics later. But I think what's important here, I want to discuss before we move into the whole entire context of that conversation. I want to bring into the discussion of women in economic development, Prof. And here I can't help but if I only wish I had that. I have got the slide, which speaks about the women from the WEF, World Economic Forum, on the women ranking of the women gender. If you notice for Malaysia, at least Tan Sri Rebecca, for Malaysia, our ranking has gone from then when we were working to now last in Southeast Asia. I've been tracking it from 2020 to 2025. In ASEAN, among ASEAN countries, Malaysia's ranking has either been second last or last. When we are second last, meaning Myanmar is last. And now Malaysia is last, right? And what are the parameters that is used to measure this? The parameters include women economic development, that's number one, and that particularly look into women in labor participation. It also look into women in health, and yes, you mentioned, Prof, women in education, and also women in politics. And what brought us down when we were second last, we were not so bad. Women in education, we were number one for about 2020 to 2023. We now dropped to number 59 in 2024, 2025. Women in health, we were number one. I think, but the significant drop in the ranking is women in labor participation, and also we look into women in politics. We're seeing less women ministers now, right, in the cabinet. So how does that conversation brings us into why ANZAC FTA upgrade matters most? Not only just about looking women in economic development, but also women in trade, and also how we put in now into the conversation the space for what you call gender responsive and disability group, as well as importantly, how we would expect better resilience and inputs coming in from SMEs, as in this digital space that we have, it makes it all the more sophisticated for MSMEs to participate in the supply chain, in particular the global supply chain. Now, if I were to bring you into conversation into the what do you call it, Malaysian statistics of MSMEs, can I have the next slide, please? The aircon is off? Yeah, sorry. So we look into the percentage of what do you call it, total business establishments in Malaysia. Back then, when we did our first census in 2002, the percentage was 99.2%. Now we see it's 98.5%, meaning that our programs worked. There were more companies now that have graduated from SME to become large. But what's important in this whole entire context and in this space, not just in Malaysia, but in all nations of the world, majority of businesses are micro enterprises, and they largely form more than 80% of total business establishments. So you're really dealing with small micro companies that has got, in some countries the definition is 5 workers and less, in some countries the definition is 10 workers and less, right? If you go into the basic usual principle of 80-20, so this is it. So you're dealing with 80% of companies that are micro, and here the SMEs are the 20%. Now, from that percentage of companies that are SMEs in Malaysia, as I saw the census, the last we did was 2015, and I just had a peek today. The 2023 census also showed that women-owned businesses are from 20% of the total business establishments, right? And how do we define women-owned businesses here in Malaysia? They are being led, equity of course is more than 50% should be led by women, so 51% and above. And also, if at all, they own 10% of the businesses, but they are the founders, they are the CEOs, then that is also defined as a women-led business. So that's how we define the women-led businesses here in Malaysia. And largely, if we see where are they here in Malaysia, what you saw here is on the left are the total business establishments, majority are in the services. So likewise, for the women in business in Malaysia, majority of them are also in the business sector, very few in manufacturing, agriculture and others. Now, why is this conversation important in the respect of ANZFTA? The big question here, how many % of these women are what you call exporters? How many of them have moved into exporting their services, their products? Sadly, here in Malaysia, what we're seeing is the fact that as far as looking at exports, they look into the value of exports, not in terms of the percentage of how many companies are exporting. So we see just about 10% of the total exports are coming from women entrepreneurs. Now, the next slide, I just wanted to share with you, in Malaysia, so what have we done? At least the question that was given to me, by SME Corp, what are the assistance that have been provided for women? And from the data that we saw in 2023, 40% of the total MSME beneficiaries are given to women entrepreneurs, all right? So we put ourselves normally a target of about 30%, so it means to say that the assistance that are being given and reached out to women entrepreneurs have exceeded the minimum 30% that we put ourselves as a target. So, of course, you see that majority of the development programs, in this case, they provide financial assistance in form of reimbursable grants. It means to say that reimbursable grants means they've spent and then the government provides 50% of their total expenditure. So what you can see from this particular slide is that We have got the BISME program, which is a program primarily for women entrepreneurs in micro enterprises. You've got the MSME Export Strengthening Program, which also facilitates women to go into export. And here is where I just want to mention that within this context, it's a much focused program. It's not looking into the micro, the 80%, but we are focusing on the 20% of women who are in the category of small and medium category that we push for, as mentioned by Professor Sufyan, ensuring that they fulfill the regulatory requirements, they know what certification they need to adhere to, and so many others in terms of branding, packaging, and others. We also have got the TUBE program, where we also see 50% of the TUBE programs were participated by women. We have the Business Accelerator program, the micro business grant, and also our usual annual program that we have is the Enterprise 50 program that also provide a space for the awards for women entrepreneurs. Now, this is as far as given by just one government agency, that's SME Corp. You have also got other government agencies that also provide women entrepreneur programs. For example, Matrade, they used to have a program called, for exporters called WTOP, which is Women on Top. And my minister asked to change that from Women on Top to Women in Exports program. So yes, so we have deliberate programs that, that do give government grants for women entrepreneurs. Now, as we move into the space of what government provides and move into what does the banking industry provides, the next slide should be able to share with you some of the financial assistance by different banks. So we have got the SME Bank. SME Bank provides 3 million facilities for under the program SME Lady. And then when I retired back then in 2018, I was brought in as a SME business advisor to Bank Islam, where I begin to start the SME banking as well the SME, Women in Business program. So we have got Women in Business in the Bank Islam program. We have got also from at the bottom, you have Wow Wanita. That is a program by Standard Chartered. We have got program by Tekun. We have got a program also, Afin Gem, for women entrepreneurs, and also by CGC, Women of Will. So these are some of the programs that are provided by the, the financial institutions outside the government. What I'm trying to say is the fact that there are opportunities, there are programs, and we want to see, of course, more women that moves into this space of how they want to grow their business. Now, one of the things that we hold dear to is the fact that I'm not too sure whether you're aware, and I'm sure do some of you who are in the micro enterprises business, even Professor Yunus, who the winner of Nobel laureate, said, women are the best paymaster. And if you see, in the whole entire context of all these financial institutions that gives, the provisions and also the lending for women, they have indeed proven that they are the better paymaster. And that was why we have our microcredit financing that was being, managed by Bank Simpanan Nasional way back when we did it in 2009. Back then, the microcredit was only given to women entrepreneurs. And indeed, it has proven to see that in terms of the NPL, the non-performing loans for that particular program by women entrepreneurs is almost nil. It's just less than 1%. So, and here is where, when you have confidence in women in doing business, and yet not many women, we saw only 20% of total business establishments are owned and operated by women. The question is, why not? And here the conversation revolves into things like culture. Here in Malaysia, women normally will stay at home because of the culture of the fact that, the man earns the income and the woman stays at home to look after the family, for example. And also, if you see another aspect of the culture is the fact that, for a lot of the conversations that we have, and also in ASEAN countries that I noticed, even to open a business and to get lending, there must be a man that comes with them. So these are some of the things that I would not say a barrier, but it is a challenge sometimes for women to go out and do business and also to get, some financial assistance that they wanted to move into. Now, as I move into this space and how we can move into some strategic opportunities that support women-led and women, with disabilities businesses under this new, protocol, upgraded AANZFTA. If I can have the next slide, please. If we move into this conversation on to design some gender responsive trade incentives. And as we look into some of these, responsive trade incentives, it includes on how we can, in actual fact, move into simplification of the export facilitation. And I think some of these things were back then. We tried to do it, but I think it's not enough. If we can move into more simplified version, now that everything is digitalized, now why not? Let's move into the next space. And then also inclusive one-stop export incubators. I think that works a lot because it does help to have these incubators, especially for women export incubator. That provides a better accessibility features to technology and barrier to trade, especially the non-tariff barriers. Moving to also the inclusive financial instruments for the trade and how we can top up the schemes. For example, I mentioned to you the SME exporter financing and microcredit supports, targeted capacity building program. We talk about it a lot. I think one thing that works well in ASEAN is the AMEN program, which is the ASEAN Exporters Mentoring Program, mentoring network. So that's something that we can utilize and expand it to also include ANZFTA. And also, of course, digitize, visibility and market access tools. Market access tools include the whole entire compliance to standards and and regulations. That has got to be put forward for them, and definitely some policy recognition framework. I've got my last 2 minutes. Can I have my last slide? So here is where this conversation that we are moving into about how then the opportunities for government to take action on some of the things that I mentioned. In terms of trade access, definitely we look into some incentives that also include women and MSMEs. Incubation, I just mentioned. On skills and mentoring, I did mention that, we moved into a space whereby a lot of entrepreneurs, either men or women, they need to be bold and brave to not just to relearn, but to unlearn, and again, to learn new skill sets, right? So that's something that we want to push across. Financing is something that I would definitely want to see some form of guarantees that we can have specifically for ANZFTA related export costs. Digital marketing that we think that will be able to be one of the tools that we want to put across. Recognition, we can have some awards and also some policy coordination across ministries, because definitely it's not just MITI alone, it has got to be across ministries that will make this happen. I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Afsar, for a very comprehensive discussion. I think one more point, we have a lot of program for transition to just transition towards green and more sustainable business. And in the discussion, I think, especially in this ASEAN chairmanship, we are looking into how MSMEs can actually benefit from this just transition. But then again, most of the time banks behave differently. We try very hard to talk to the central bank, to Securities Commission, but then again, I think they are very general focused, not very much focused on women entrepreneurs, and most of the time, women entrepreneurs stay at home because they have obligation to the family, they have to take care of the kids, but at the same time treating their business as part-time, not really full-time. So how can a free trade agreement can actually be more effectively integrated in this kind of environment, especially in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN? So let's hear more from Richard, please.
Thank you, Professor Sufyan. That question, thanks to all the speakers. It's been a very interesting panel so far and excellent research as well, Tara. Look, what I wanted to talk about a bit this afternoon is to sort of showcase what we're doing from the Australian trade policy side and in terms of our free trade agreements implementation and bringing in gender equality into our free trade agreements. Part of what I was going to talk about today was the why, but I think that has been more covered more than adequately this afternoon. So I don't think that I need to go through that too much, but what I would like to talk about, I guess, is what we are doing, the how, that we're taking it forward. So alongside my role as ASEP and ANZFTA lead is also I look after our inclusive trade team in DFAT, and they are mandated, or we are mandated, to pursue gender equality and other inclusive trade provisions in all of our trade agreements. So it is it's sort of a decision, a mandate that we have, that we will raise and pursue gender equality provisions in all of our free trade agreements. That's come about through our international gender equality strategy. So Australia's international gender equality strategy that was launched by our foreign minister. So it's a strong commitment, and I understand that Malaysia has made a similar commitment actually to pursue these provisions as well. I was pleased to hear from Mia about the value of pursuing these provisions. We think it's important, and we do so for a number of reasons. In our trade agreements, and we now have a number where we have trade in gender outcomes, including our Australia-United Kingdom Free Trade Agreement, which has our first ever chapter on gender equality. We've of course got it in ANZFTA under the Trade and Sustainable Development chapter. In the upgrade on women's economic empowerment, we have included women's economic empowerment provisions in our agreement with the United Arab Emirates as well. And we're really looking to pursue it through the CPTPP, which went forward without anything on, well, it does have women's economic empowerment, but gender equality provisions aren't in there as yet. So that's something we want to do in our CPTPP chair year, is to bring that forward, and we're working closely with Malaysia in that context too. In those agreements, what we do is we reaffirm international commitments. That's important for us because we need to be vocal. We need to be mainstreaming these commitments. It's always important to recognise and notify, appreciate all of the commitments that we undertake more broadly to gender equality. We also, of course, look at ways to cooperate and to work together with our trading partners to identify, and it's key to be able to identify the barriers that women entrepreneurs face, and then to work together on how do we address them. And so it's really, these are commitments based in cooperation. We, of course, look through the FTA in its entirety to ensure that the barriers are being reduced, and we're making it easier for all businesses to move forward, because we know that helps female-led businesses as well. But we need specific provisions to help us cooperate on gender equality, because of the, as Tara said before, trade is not gender neutral, and trade provisions and free trade agreements are not gender neutral. So we move that forward, and that's important for us because we don't, honestly, Australia doesn't have all the answers actually. We don't have all the answers as to how to promote gender equality through trade agreements. And so we do actually genuinely use these trade agreements to work with our trade partners to improve. Tara mentioned gender disaggregated data is a really key area where we need improvement. That is true in Australia, as I think it is in many countries. We are short of that form of data. I'd be really interested in your report to see how we can make improvements there. But for example, through our United Kingdom Free Trade Agreement, we've been working with the United Kingdom to identify how do we do that? Like, what are the issues that we need to do? How do they undertake gender disaggregated trade data and make improvements? We've been doing that through CPTPP engagements, and we do that through also a multilateral sphere with the Inclusive Trade Action Group and the GTAGA, Gender Trade Action Group, or Global Trade Agenda for Gender. It's got too many G's, T's in that agreement. But we cooperate because we need to understand how to do it ourselves. So it's been really valuable. We've started to look at data, in fact, in terms of trade in goods. So as I'm fascinated that you've done it for services, we've had some people just having a preliminary look at the trade in goods, and they've found that goods exporters, women are much underrepresented in terms of their participation in goods exports, and they are less well paid compared to their male counterparts in goods export industries. But on the flip side, women who are participating in goods exports are earning more than the female counterparts who are not involved in goods exports. So there's so much to unpack there. It's just a preliminary dive, but that sort of work helps for policy. It can lead us down the track towards policy outcomes in the future. So we're really invested in sort of learning from others in this space. The third priority for us is, we include the provisions, we implement, we work together, we cooperate, and the technical assistance remains a priority for Australia because it's so important. It's important in the region. It's important for Australia for our international gender equality strategy to promote gender equality outcomes in this region in particular. So it's great to see some of the work that's been going on. We do it through, of course, through many programs, which I can't necessarily name. The ones that are close to my heart is the Regional Trade for Development program that we're here for today, then Trade and Gender Equality Incubator and the work that they're doing to support sort of research and development. We've had a range of programs come forward under Regional Trade for Development. I should say that we have, and I hope some of you are familiar with Gender Equality, Disability and Social Inclusion, GEDSI. We have a twin track approach on GEDSI to RT4D. All projects under RT4D must have consider how to include the voices of women. So that's our track one approach, mainstreaming gender equality through all of our technical assistance capacity building. But we also have track two, where we have specific defined programs to support increasing, specifically targeted for women and other disadvantaged groups to promote their participation. So an example of that is where we supported Ministry of Industry and Commerce in Lao PDR for accelerating women's advancement in intellectual property. It's actually a really great program where women entrepreneurs participated in a workshop to improve their understanding of IP and patent applications. And I think of the 24 participants, I think almost all of them ended up successfully securing patents. So it's like a tangible outcome. That's the sort of programs that we're interested in continuing to support, to support increased women's economic empowerment and gender equality. So I'll leave it there. That's what we're trying to do with our free trade agreements, and we want to keep working on them, including with Malaysia, in all of our forums.
Thank you, Richard. Let's hear from one of our most experienced trade negotiator, trade policy designer, and a practitioner in the region. We have been hearing a lot about gender trade, but how do we really get ASEAN and also APEC member states to really support all this, make it happen really, rather than just talk and very high level policy discussion?
Yep. Thank you, Prof. Sufyan. The mic's working, right? Thanks again to the organizers for and and Australia for focusing, bringing us here to focus on this subject. Let me just say that we've not done this for any of the FTAs that I've been involved in. And ASEAN, it's ironic, we are doing it here, but ASEAN hasn't done anything specific for gender equality in any of our agreements, our trade agreements, very specific. Okay, that's to put it out there. So it is a massive thing for us to begin this journey. And I'm glad that we're doing it, because I'd like to see how this then would dovetail into the other work that we're doing with the other FTAs that we're reviewing. We've finished a review with China, and I don't think it's in there. The upgrade of the trade agreement, the ASEAN trade agreement, ATICA, I don't think it's there. I don't think it's in the upgrade of AFAS, the services agreement. So we have not done it for ASEAN. And I want to also say that the points about sex desegregated data is repeated ad nauseum. But so we need to really do something about it, working with our respective statistics departments. So even before we go into how government is going to support the gender agenda in ASEAN-FTA, we need to get back to basics and get to those things. Thank you, Tara, for the work on services. It's very thorough. I think I've not seen something as detailed as that yet. We have to do something similar for goods, I think, trade in goods. And the World Bank and WTO came up with a report on trade and gender in 2020. They reviewed it. It was a work in progress. They reviewed it as COVID was happening. It was very interesting. But one thing that struck me was, I've been in the trade policy space for the longest time, but never thought of the gender aspect of trade, never. And that report sort of got me to think differently, because, we always say trade is gender neutral, and it's a good thing that it's gender neutral, but it's not. So what we need also to do to support this whole process of, as we're looking at upgrading the ASEAN-FTA, is to really do a deep dive into the tariff lines, because while we have, I know, zero duty access for Australia and New Zealand, but among ourselves in ASEAN, it's not necessarily so. So do deep dive into those lines to see where there are lines of products that could affect women. So I'm talking of what we now term pink tariffs. So tariffs on women's hygiene products, for example, tariffs on agriculture, because a lot of women are involved in agriculture, and textiles, for example. So these are things that we still need to do more of. I think we haven't done enough. So if governments of ASEAN are going to support this whole process, that is one area of work that needs to be done. The other is, as we've done this in APEC, a lot of the women are in the informal sector. So the other aspect, if we can capture that, some of the work that we've done in APEC into the ASEAN-FTA, to see how we can get folks to work, governments to really work towards moving SMEs or women entrepreneurs who are in the informal sector into the formal sector. That is another area of work. If that can be captured, would be really, really useful. I also did some work on the chapter by chapter for ASEAN-FTA, and there is so many opportunities. There are many opportunities for us to ensure that we embed the gender aspects into the agreement itself. One chapter is standards. Standards, again, the assumption is standards and conformance neutral, but not really, because they are, you have to factor in women's sizes, women's preferences, things like that. So I think there's opportunity for us to look at gender in standard setting. So have the women in the room and start to think in terms of gender. I've been in negotiations, I've been in some of these discussions, but I don't have that lens. because I've not had that lens. So it's about now getting us to start thinking differently. So it's a mindset shift that we need across the board, not just policymakers who are men, but policymakers who are women too need this. So I think that's one big area that we need to touch on if we're going to support this agenda in ASEAN-FTA. Looking at trade in services, okay, market access is the other area. Additional, there's Article 4 in Chapter 8 of ASEAN-FTA. Look at Article 4, and when you look at market access, how we can inject the gender aspects there. Because unless it's captured, unless it's brought to the surface, it won't happen. So you need to elevate it, you need to bring it into consciousness, as they say. There is another article, Article 5, on additional commitments. So these are areas where you can already start injecting binding commitments. Domestic regulation, I think, was mentioned earlier. And interestingly, financial services. I know Dato' Hafsa mentioned a whole bunch of things that Malaysia's doing to provide services, but let me just say that in the study that we did in APAC, Malaysia has no law against discrimination in access to credit based on gender. What does that mean? It doesn't mean that our law is gender neutral. What it means is that financial institutions can discriminate against women applying for credit, and it is okay because we do not have the law. So in the work that we've been doing in APAC, every time I get an opportunity to talk to finance ministers, I highlight this. It's easy to say we provide financial access, but you drill down deeper to make sure there is legal basis for what we say. So this is another area that we could inject into ASEAN-FTA to make it more binding. On economic cooperation, I think there's a lot that has been said about economic cooperation. So the chapter itself provides us that opportunity to inject more capacity building, technical assistance for women, to not just women, but I think the whole gender awareness, you know, in all the work that we do can be highlighted in the capacity building technical assistance programs. Are we having a chapter on gender in ASEAN-FTA upgrade? Maybe that's something we need to think about. And to have that chapter, we really need to work the ground, because it is not something ASEAN has done, and therefore when it's not something ASEAN has done, we have to work twice as hard to convince ASEAN that it's something that is worth doing. So that's a challenge for the ASEAN-FTA negotiation team. Sustainable development, I think that's another area, trade and sustainable development. I know you're having a chapter on that. Very important to ensure that there is language that would bind us for women's economic empowerment, and on as a broader part of inclusion and sustainable goals. MSME chapter, yes, again, in fact, all of our agreements, the chapters are gender neutral. So if we want to make sure that there is focus on gender, we have to say it. If it's not said, it then taken for granted. It need not necessarily mean that it covers everybody. So those are things, I think opportunity is there as we are doing this, but the way we get ASEAN to support this effort is to really work the ground, to convince ASEAN member states and the negotiators that it's something worth doing, because we have not done it before. Thank you.
Thank you, Tan Sri Rebecca. Right, we are left with like 8 minutes, but I will give a chance to the online questions. Ranhan shared with me 4 questions from online colleagues. First, it's still a huge challenge for us to advocate stronger emphasis on developing or helping women in trade and business, largely because of the culture here in Asia. How does the members of the panel feel about this statement? And if FTAs such as ASEAN-FTA can push for a paradigm shift towards a more gender equal policy landscape, economic environment. Next, this is from one of our colleagues at in UKM. From my side, exporting food additive ingredients from China to Malaysia and Singapore, I found one thing based on the experience. The purchasing managers in Malaysia and Singapore I cooperated with are all women, which is the opposite to the situation of male purchasing managers in China. And I'm not sure if this is good evidence related to the issue. That's fine. That's about waiters, Powerpuff Girls. Next. I have two more questions. All right, from Suhaili. It's a straight question to Dato' Hafsa. With Malaysia accelerating its shift towards the digital economy, how is SME Corp supporting women entrepreneurs to close the digital divide? And then Lubna, all the way from Vancouver, if there are plans to introduce the ASEAN-Australia-New trade protocol perspective and aspects of applications in regards of gender equity as part of the educational material of universities to go across the new generations. So maybe I'd like to get Dr. Hafsa's perspective, not just to that particular question, maybe to all.
Thank you so much, Prof. I think if I can just answer this question is simpler, then I go to the other one. I cannot speak on behalf of SME Corp. I want to remind ourselves here, I'm a retiree. I retired from SME Corp the last 8 years. But having said that, I think we started putting in women into the digital space back then. If I recall, it was 2012. Already we have got programs for women in technology and women in digitalization. I believe that they are still doing it now, because I do know they have got special provisions, financial incentives for women in digital economy. And I would not say that they will be left behind, but I think they are very much into it, because I do meet some women entrepreneurs recently who are in the digital space, and they do receive incentives from the government being in this digital economy. So definitely we want to close the digital divide, and we want to make sure that no one is left behind. Also the micro enterprises. To the first question, you was a question on this the Asian culture that I mentioned, and I think Prof has alluded to the fact that here in Asia we are women is expected to be more staying at home and look after the family, and more than to be out doing business, and also to take leadership positions. What we are seeing here today is the fact that, at least in my work in the Women Leadership Foundation, we are working with the women entrepreneurs, making sure that they understand the fact that before they become an entrepreneur, they must become a leader first. Only then can they manage a team. Only then can they manage a company. And moving into that space, we're moving into a lot of work that we do with micro enterprises, especially what they say here is single mothers. Because when they become single mothers, it's about survival in the economy. How do they survive to bring up their children, and how do they survive for themselves even in this space? So here is where what we are looking into the fact that within the context of ASEAN-FTA, right, and the inclusion of this new chapter, I want to concur what Professor Dr. Tan Sri Rebecca mentioned. Are we brave enough to put a chapter to include gender into it? Are we brave enough to put a chapter to include MSMEs in it? As Tan Sri mentioned here earlier, I concur with you. I don't think that in other FTAs we have had this conversation of wanting to put in gender into the conversation.
Can I just
Yes.
add? One of the reasons for ASEAN not doing this is structural, because for ASEAN, the issues on gender is discussed in the social cultural pillar and not the economic pillar. So as long as it stays in that pillar, they will be focusing on human rights, labor rights for women, So it is really now about ASEAN, and this I've said many times, needs to relook its own structure to ensure that, by the way, sustainability is also lodged in the social cultural pillar. So we really need to mainstream some of this and have a cross-pillar conversation. Otherwise, you won't get where you want to get with your ASEAN-Australia agenda. No?
Maybe it's time for Richard to correspond to that.
Thank you. Really good points. I just touch on the on this, like how do we move, and I think it was the first question as well, how do we move these sort of gender-related provisions given a pervading culture? So I guess when I started trade negotiations, which is 20 years ago actually, we had a goods team, we had a services team, and we had, you know, maybe a rules of origin team. That was an investment. That was FTAs. We've got an inclusive trade team now. So we have negotiators now who are sort of navigating the divide between the social and the economic and the trade. And I think that's been a very important sort of development in our trade policy. I think, and potentially that has more of a bearing on our ability to get these provisions in, is the capacity. Because we've got negotiators who are focused on what they're used to, which is tariff line services schedules. Do we have people who can look at tariff line services schedules and know the impact on gender or on environment or labour? That's kind of what we need. I think we're getting there. So, and I don't think culture is necessarily a reason why we can't do more when in ASEAN in particular. Like we have an agreement with the UAE on United Arab Emirates on women's economic empowerment. We have WTO declarations on women's economic empowerment. It's going to be just a process. We can't just jump from zero to everything all at once, but through a process and through building up our negotiating capacities as well. I think we'll get there.
Sorry, can I also say that even if you embed some of these this language in the ASEAN-FTA, it has to, you also need to find a way, and I think Mia highlighted that one of her slides at the end, that you need to measure. It's okay to have those the language embedded or to have provisions embedded in the ASEAN-FTA, but more importantly is to track it, to ensure it's implemented. And this is a tough one to implement. And what we've done in APEC, and I think really folks can use this, is the dashboard, the Women and the Economy dashboard, which really tracks how all the rules and regulations, if you want, you can add behind the border and at the border kind of provisions, and then track it so that it's not quite a naming and shaming. You know how we're not comfortable with naming and shaming, but at least it gives you an idea of where we are with regulations, how many regulations need to change, and things like that. I mean, you need to be able to track it, and if you can embed a dashboard in the ASEAN-FTA, good for you.
All right, Mia, you have any response?
Yes, I was putting my my hand up.
We have not forgotten you.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Rebecca, for mentioning the major problem in ASEAN being that these issues are parked in social community, and therefore, you know, people don't see really the real incentive of changing things. Because they don't see the money behind it. And so they keep discussing about maternity and, as you said, human rights, but not a woman as economic resource. But we don't have time to go into all of that. I just wanted to say two things about improving RTAs towards really focusing on women's issues. I think we can adopt a saying from another inclusivity issues and say nothing about women without women. And so when you see who is negotiating and how is negotiating, and a very important chapter of RTAs about institutional arrangements, about the committees that are there to actually monitor and put forward the proposals for corrections of the provisions, etc. Very few women involved, and none of the articles would actually prescribe that there should be women representatives in these committees. We have made a progress in some of these agreements to put in provisions for inclusive for indigenous peoples to be represented, but women are still not there. And so that is one key element where we need to make clear that women need to be involved in decision making for these changes to be made, because I think we have had enough of men making the decisions on how to improve gender equality. So that's one thing, and that goes very far in terms of statistics. When you look at statistics and why data is not there, is that those that make decisions on investments, on improving statistics collections, are not interested in having sex disaggregated data. And as long as we allow that to happen, we will not have data. So the decision to invest in better collection of data needs to be made. And I think we are all responsible to make this decision happen. So on this very sort of feministic, I would say, angle, thank you, Sufyan, for giving me the floor.
Thank you, Mia. I think we have to come to the close. On behalf of the National University of Malaysia, I would like to thank all the panelists, Tan Sri Rebecca, Dato' Hafsa, Richard, and Mia. And then, of course, we would like to thank the Regional Trade for Development Program, Trade and Gender Equality Incubator, DFAT, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade of Australia, and colleagues, Tara and Milin, for making this happen. I think this topic is very important for everyone in this room. As a university, I encourage my researchers to take up this issue. As one of those who work on trade, maybe this is also an issue for ASEAN negotiators to look into, working beyond our three pigeonholes. In the last, before we finalized the plan, I still remember in one of those ASEAN high-level task force meetings, we had a long discussion about doing away with these three pillars. Instead, we should have one, but then the ASEAN way prevailed. So we ended up having these three pillars again for the next 20 years. So with that, let us give a round of applause to all our panelists, and thank you very much. So I hand this over to Ranhan. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sufyan, as our moderator, and thank you to all the panelists for your contribution today. May I invite Professor Dr. Sufyan Jusuf, Vice Chancellor of UKM, to present tokens of appreciation, accompanied by the Dean of Faculty of Education, Professor Dr. Muhammad Mahzan Awang, to Dato' Dr. Hafsa Hashim, on behalf of ICMAS and the Faculty of Education, UKM.
That's the picture of UKM.
Mr. Richard Emerson Elliott.
This is a small picture of the National University and some books as well. You can't sleep in the plane. Thank you very much.
Tan Sri Dato' Dr. Rebecca Fatimah Maria. And also Miss Tara Francis. Yeah. We will also like to thank Dr. Mia Mikish, who joined us online, for her contribution as a panelist. Yes. Let's give them all a big round of applause for their valuable contributions today. Yeah, may I kindly invite all panelists, speakers, and moderator to remain on stage for a group photo. And also a group photo with all the distinguished guests and participants. Thank you. Before we proceed, we would like to invite all participants to take the next 2-3 minutes to scan the QR code on the screen and provide your quick feedback on today's program. Yes, we would like to invite you all to scan the QR code and provide your quick feedback. Thank you very much for your feedback. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of our session this afternoon. On behalf of the organizers, we extend our thanks to all our presenters, speakers, partners, and participants, both here in person and joining us virtually, for making today's dialogue so meaningful. For those here on site, we warmly invite you to join us for coffee, tea, and fellowship. Refreshments are served at the foyer of the hall. Thank you once again and have a pleasant evening.